Hello there everybody, I'm Aditya and today we're going to be looking at an intro to modeling. And so we're going to be doing this right now in Maya 2022, but you can use other softwares like Blender and use the basic steps to be able to do the exact same things that we are doing here. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing you want to do when it comes to modeling is you want to make sure that you have your references set up inside of your scene. So what are references? References can be blueprints or pictures that you can add to any of the orthographic views or side views of your scene right here. And the reason why we do this is because we can actually model off of them from like a specific angle, and you can basically use that to create the 3D object with reference from multiple angles. So how do we do this? How do we set up these references? The first thing we want to do is we actually want to learn how to navigate to the quadrant view. So the way that you do that is you press the space key. And when you do this, you actually realize that you actually have your perspective view over here on the right-hand side on the upper corner, but you also have three other views. You have the top view, the front view, and the side view. Now these views are going to be super useful because unlike this view right here, which is called the perspective view, these views are orthogonal or orthographic. The reason why this view is really useful is because you are getting an undistorted view of the top, the front, and the side without having any distortions due to scaling or moving back and front with perspective. So to kind of demonstrate how that is, we're actually going to go ahead and add a reference image to the side view right here. Now the way that we do this, and you might be wondering how I actually got to this side view. The way that you have to do that is you just have to put your cursor over here and then press space, and you'll actually go into the view that you need to. So if we want to switch back to perspective view, you press space again, go to the quadrant view, and then put your cursor up here to the perspective window, press space again, and then you can move back and forth. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the view section, and we're going to go to image plane, and then we are going to import image. Now, you can actually search up your image and have it wherever you've saved it. For me, I saved it here in the pictures folder and inside of lamp ref. As you can see, we have our side view right here, so I can just open this up. And perfect, we have ourselves our side view as a plane in the space. And to see how it looks like here, you can actually see that it's right in the center of this plane. Now, we also want to add a back view or a view from the front, but that's inverted. Now right here, you have the front view, which means if I were to add this plane right here, this would be wrong. So how do I change this from front to back? The way that you do this is that you press spacebar and then click and drag to whatever view you want to set this as. So for me, I want to set this to the back view. So I'll just click and drag, select it, and then now, as you can see, it has been turned into the back view. So now we have our side and our back. Now, there's a reason why I don't have a front view and why I don't need it. It's because that in the front, all you'll be seeing is just the lamp itself and the bulb that's inside of it. So it's pretty easy to understand where that is. But in the back view, there's a lot of details that are being hidden that we want to make sure that we can get, like a bunch of holes right here, how the extrusion and the sizing of this button right there, and also where the springs are going to be sitting. So these are important information, which is why the back view for this project is going to be really important. But again, now that I've shown you how to change these views, you can change them to whatever liking and use whatever is useful for this project. So let's go ahead and go back to the back view. We want to go ahead and add another image plane. So let's go ahead and import image. And then let's go ahead and go back to the place that we had before, which is lamp ref. And then we're going to go ahead and import the back view. Perfect. We have ourselves our two views right here. Something to note though is that this back view doesn't seem to be showing up here. And that's probably because it's probably being hidden in space somewhere. So how do we go find an object that we can't immediately see in our viewport? Well, you could zoom and scroll all the way out here, but the easiest way to get to that position would be to go ahead and press the F key, which will take you to whatever highlighted object, wherever it is in space. So now that we know that this back view is right there, we know our perspective view and our actual plane is all the way over here. So we might want to push this all the way up front. And if we were to go to press F again, we can actually go ahead and go back to this grid view where this object is and align it to the plane. Now, you'll see a very interesting phenomenon whenever we go back to our orthographic view. So if we were to press space and then go to our back view, you actually see that this plane has not actually changed size. This is again because this is an orthographic view and there's no perspective distortion whenever you're moving and scaling anything. So because of that, this is actually why we use these views to be able to model so that we get a more accurate one-to-one representation of objects. So, as you can see right here, we can have our two planes aligned. We do see that some of these objects are not exactly aligned pretty well. And in fact, this is probably due to the fact that whenever you're taking pictures of reference, the camera has perspective. And there's not really an orthographic camera available to be able to use. So, it's a lot of approximation. The best advice that I can give as far as finding good references for an object would be to find blueprints, because those can be drawn in an orthographic view, which you cannot do the same for in a camera. But for right now, we can just use this as approximations. And while it's not going to be exactly one-to-one, we can use this for mostly for scaling and for getting to somewhere that's a little bit more accurate than you'd imagine. You can also see that right now the size differences are a little bit concerning. So we can go ahead and just push this down a little bit. And what we want to do is we want to kind of align the head of this lamp to this plane as well. So we might just have to do just a tad bit of scaling. Let's go ahead and do that just a little bit. You want to make sure that you don't want to push this too far, because that could cause even more distortions whenever you're trying to model. But I would say that this is actually a pretty decent spot to be in. We can actually push this up a little bit, make this just a little bit smaller so that it kind of aligns down in the bottom as well. And I would say that this is actually a pretty darn close lamp view and correction that we can see right here. So now that we've set up our planes, we want to go back, and actually what we want to do is that because we can go and move these planes as much as we want to in the front or the back of this axis to where that they won't distort in these specific views, I actually want to push this all the way over here, and I want to push this all the way over here. And whenever we do this, as you can see, the views don't actually change, but that's actually good for us, because what that tells us is that from the back view, if I were to go over here, and if I were to see the back, that this object would be perfectly there, and if I were to go look at the side, the object would be perfect over here on both of these views. Awesome. So now that we have our references set up, this should be working pretty well, but next thing we want to look at is scaling. So the best way to make sure that your objects are in real world scale is to go ahead and create a cube right here. Now the way that you create a cube is that you go up to this shelf right here and go ahead and select this cube from the poly modeling section. Whenever we do this, we have ourselves a cube. Now, by default, Maya is in the standard unit of centimeters. So one Maya unit, as you can see, which is this cube is 1 by 1 by 1, would be considered 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. So what we want to do is we want to check this with human scale. And so the way that we can actually do this is by making sure that we scale this up to the height of a human. So to demonstrate this, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead to the cube over here and go to the attribute editor, go to scale, and type in 183 in the y-axis section of scale. And whenever we do this, you start to realize this is a very, very, very tall cube. That is because, again, we are in centimeters. So we want to make sure that we can get that there. Now, as you can see, I'm trying to move this up, but it's kind of hard to align it from the bottom right here. So if we were to move back here, and let's say I want to keep this pivot to the bottom, the easiest way to get this to be fixed so that we can bring this over here is that we press the D key. And as you can see, we get this little gimbal right there, which shows us that we're actually going to be moving the pivot and not the entire object itself. The pivot is the point where your object is going to be rotating, scaling, and translating in. So what we have to do this, when we press D, we want to press this move tool right here, and then we want to move this all the way down till we reach the bottom. Let's go ahead and go back and scroll down over here to somewhere that's around approximate where we want this to be. So once we do this, we go ahead and we can select outside, and now your pivot has been set to this bottom point. We can go ahead and move this up now to the plane so that we get to we can align this with the grid. Let's go ahead and do that right now. So as you can see, it's a little bit hard to navigate, so feel free to move around, zoom back out, and then we can push this down so that it's aligning right here. Wonderful. Awesome. So now we got our giant cube that is now basically a rectangular cube aligned all the way down over here. Now, this human scale right here seems to be pretty tall, and so something we got to realize is that when you're comparing a desk lamp to a human, the desk lamp would be a little bit bigger than just the scale that we have right now with the planes. So the most important thing to do right now is we want to make sure our image planes are scaled proportionally instead of just being individually scaled. Because remember, we did scale one of these planes over here to align it with this other one. So if we were to select both of them and scale them, there will be scale mismatches that we want to avoid. So what's the best way to keep their scales consistent and their position consistent? Well, the easiest way to do so would be to make them into a group. So go ahead and select this object and then shift select this other object. And then once you do this, you want to press Control G. And we've made these references into a group. Go ahead and name your references to make sure that it's easier to see which they are. You should be keeping most of your objects in groups anyway, so it's actually a really good exercise to be able to do so. We can go ahead and scale it. And we can actually see that everything is scaling accordingly from the center pivot point, which that should be okay. We can scale it to however length we like. For right now, I think that turning this to a scale of 4 would be ideal. So we can go ahead and do that to integers. Now once we do this, this seems to be a much more reasonable length for a desk lamp. We want it to be kind of have it to the length of kind of a chest area upwards to your neck or up to the head. So I think this would actually be a pretty decent scaling amount. So now that we've decided that this is the scaling amount, what we want to do now is we actually want to go ahead and move this so that it's actually on top of the ground plane with the bottom of the lamp itself. So let's go ahead to one of these views, and then we're going to go ahead and move this up so that this is being aligned all the way over here. Now, we can align this right over here to the center, but actually for this right now, I can go ahead and just move this right there, which honestly should not be an issue. But what I would recommend is that for most models, you want to align whatever starting primitive that you're using to this center area of the grid, just so that it's easier to work with and navigate. So now that we got this, we can go ahead and check this on the other side, and it seems that for the most part, this seems to be aligned pretty well. Our reference right here is moved up a little bit, so we might want to actually move it down just a tad bit, and I think that this should be pretty well aligned. So now that we have officially set up our references, we can go ahead and delete this rectangular prism, and then now if we were to go back, we have ourselves all of our references perfectly enabled, set up, and ready to model. Now that we have our references recorded, the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we get our base model figured out. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, this seems like a very, very complicated model, right? There's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of very interesting shapes. It seems very difficult to be able to create this. But the good news here is that actually this is a very simple model to do. And the reason why is because of two little principles. The first thing is, of course, that every one of these objects can be broken down into simpler shapes that are called primitives. So a lot of the primitives that you see here are actually found in this shelf right here. And you can pretty much break all these down, all these complicated shapes and structures, into very simple shapes that basically give you a general gist of how they can be constructed from. For example, if we were to look at this lamp head right here, this is technically a distorted or extruded cylinder. So we can just base it off of a cylinder and work with this. Same thing over here, we have an actual cylinder right here, but even for these little bracket pieces, these are basically triangles or planes that are distorted and moved around. So by breaking that apart with simple shapes, what we realize is that we can make very complicated looking objects constructed from very simple objects. The next principle we got to realize is that there's a lot of repeated pieces here, like these little bolts right there. We have our little springs, we have the holes right here, and a lot of repetition actually makes it very easy to model because you don't have to actually do each one of them individually. You can actually go ahead and just take a piece and duplicate it. The other part of this too, and this is a very important thing for a lot of beginner modelers to understand, is that you do not have to have every single thing here connected. That is a huge trap that people fall into. What we want to do is that eventually whenever we create our object, we want to put them all inside of a group instead of having them all be one object. Because whenever that happens, not only is it really hard and complicated to model all these fitting together and interlocking correctly, and that seems like a very advanced decision to make, but the other problem with this is that it actually causes a lot of problems when it comes to things like UV unwrapping and texturing that come on later in the process. So make sure to split apart your models into pieces and come up with a plan of attack for actually modeling this. So if I were to model this object, how would I start? First, let's go ahead and break this up into pieces that we can tackle and come up with a strategy of how we're going to tackle this. Right now, this bottom area just seems to be pretty much a cylinder. So we can just go ahead and use the cylinder and shape it and scale it to however this orientation is. Same thing over here with these little two parts of the stand. Should be pretty simple. The next thing we want to do is that we have this little area right here. Now this little notch slash clamp right here seems to be created by some sort of plane with a little bit of extrusion that has a lot of these bendy areas in its form. So we can just go ahead and use a plane right here to be able to create this, or even work with something like a cube to be able to create this as well. Same thing over here with this plate, and same thing with this plate. When it comes to these screws, we just have to model them separately, and we can model them from either a cylinder or a circle right here. And then when it comes to this lamp, at the end of the day, like I mentioned, it kind of looks like a cylinder, so we can just model it from a cylinder. So with these bars, these seems to be a lot of cubes that are just extruded out and made it into a lengthy piece. So now that we've actually broken down, we have a nice little plan of attack for how we're going to be creating this more complicated object. Let's go ahead and get started with those steps. So now that we have our references set up and everything in its proper place, let's go ahead and get started with our plan of attack. So let's go ahead and go to our side view. As you can see, we have our lamp right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and spawn a cylinder from the poly modeling tab. Perfect. We have ourselves a little bit of a cylinder. And then now what we have to do is we have to go ahead and align this to the correct place that we need it to be. So something important to know about navigation. You can actually navigate through this little side panel right here to go to translate, rotate, and scale. These are the most important functions to do when working with 3D modeling and manipulation. But something really important to realize is that you can actually use shortcuts to make the navigation process even easier for these objects. How do you do that? You can press Q to be able to select things, W to be able to translate, E to be able to rotate, and then R to be able to scale. So if you go from W, E, and R, you can switch between translation, rotation, and scaling relatively easily. So let's go ahead and press the W key, move this all the way over here. And what we want to do is we want to actually kind of increase the size to somewhere around right there. And then go ahead and move this up just a little bit, start aligning it, and then go to the scale, adjust it just a little bit again. And then now what we want to do is we actually want to scale this all the way across. Now, for scaling this, we could scale it right here, but what we're going to do is we're going to go and press spacebar, move over here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to press R, and then we're going to actually scale it by two axes. We're going to scale it by this Z axis and the X axis. So the way that we can do that is we can just press this little cube right here, and as you can see, it's scaling up perfectly. So let's go ahead and scale it this way. And let's check our scaling over here. It seems to be scaled just a tad bit bigger. Let's go ahead and bring this down to somewhere right here. And I think we have ourselves a pretty darn good scaling of this area. Something that we actually notice right here is that this doesn't seem to be aligned with this reference image. And actually in this instance, because it's aligned right here and this reference image could be aligned a little bit better, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to translate this reference image just down a little bit, so that we can get this to a little bit of a better spot. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fix the scaling just a little bit and just adjust it so that it's looking a little bit closer to what we want it to be. This won't be exactly accurate, but we can make it just about as accurate as we need it to be. Let's go ahead and scale this up just a little bit more to get it a little bit more aligned. Scale this down, adjust, and then move this down a little bit. And then now we have ourselves a cylinder that seems to be pretty closely aligned. Now you might be wondering about what this little rounded area is. That is the perspective distortion that I was talking about from the camera. So we actually don't have to worry about getting this to be the exact height over here, because you're just seeing it from the warp of the perspective. But now we have ourselves a cylindrical disc that'll serve as the base for the lamp. What about these little standing areas right here? Well, the way to do this would be something similar to what we did right here, which is just to create another cylinder. Let's go ahead and press the cylinder tab, move this up, move it up, and then same thing. We're going to go ahead and scale this down over here, And if you use this yellow cube right here, you're actually scaling on all axes. So we can just basically do that and scale it over here. And then we can actually scale it up by the y-axis to get it over here. You can push this up a little bit, and then we're going to do the exact same thing. But now what we're going to be doing is we're going to Shift D to duplicate the mesh. And we're going to move this up, and then we're going to scale this down so that the size is good. Translate down, and scale it down just a little bit more so that's aligning correctly. Perfect. And now, as we can see, we have ourselves the perfect alignment for our lamp, and it seems to be working on both of these views. Perfect. Let's go ahead and move this up just a little bit, just for adjustments purposes. Sweet. And now that we did this, we can actually go back here, and we have our cylinders aligned correctly in this view. The reason why a lot of artists move and check on the perspective view as well is to make sure that it's aligned correctly on multiple fronts and in views that are not important to you. So as you can see, we're not actually using the top view here. So it's actually important to make sure that it's in the correct spot where it would be for the top view. And it seems like it is. So this seems pretty successful. Perfect. So now that we've created these with primitives, we realize that we have the simple shapes. Now what we have to do is now we get to the little bit more of a harder section, which is creating this plate right here to be able to add a clamp. Awesome, so now that we've created this base, the next thing we want to create is this little irregular plate right here. Now, how exactly do we go about doing this? Well, we can go ahead and start with a plane right here to be able to create this and then start extruding. I might be wondering, what exactly is extrusion? Well, extrusion is where you add three-dimensionality to it, where if I were to take the top or a face and actually push it up a little bit and create a 3D structure from a certain area. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go to polygonal plane. As you can see, we have our plane right here, but it seems to be facing in the exact same orientation of this grid right here. So what do we want to do is we actually want to rotate this 90 degrees so that it's facing us. And the way that we can do this is that we can go over here to plane, and then we can rotate to an exact extent of 90 degrees on the z-axis. And it seems to work pretty good. Awesome. So next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and make sure that this is the correct orientation. Now as you can see right here, this plane seems to have this kind of dark edge that we're seeing. What we want to do is we want to make sure that the normals are actually flipped. So what we want to do is we actually want to rotate this again, but instead of 90, you want to do -90. So to know if your mesh is facing the correct way, it should have a kind of white shading to it. If it has a dark shading, it means that it's an inside face, and we do not want that at all. So that is something very important to keep track of. So right now, these faces right here have this kind of white shading, and is blending into the darkness, which is the correct way for it to be there. Awesome. Next thing we want to do is we're going to go ahead and move to side view again, and then align this with the plate, and actually do the same kind of scaling. So we want to scale this up, and we want to get it to somewhere that's a little bit approximate. Let's go ahead and move this over here. And we're not going to scale it the entire way, because what we want to do is we want to eventually push these vertices to kind of line up with this shape. So you have a good view of where everything is. So let me go ahead and make this even shorter. Perfect. So now we have ourselves a nice little plane. Now, how do we change this shape into this shape? The way that we do this is we actually move into edit mode. Right now, your object should be in object display or object mode. And the way that you know this is because of the green outline on the object. But you can actually edit these points and vertices and lines and faces. And the way that you can actually do this is by left clicking and then dragging to whatever mode you want it to go to. So we are right now currently in object mode. But what we want to do is we want to actually go into vertex mode. As you can see, you're actually being able to see all the vertices that are connected into this plane. The other thing you can see too is that as you're hovering by, you can actually go ahead and see which vertice that you're about to select. Let's go ahead and select this vertice right here in the corner. You can actually go ahead and translate and push this up to a place that we want it to be. Now, you might be thinking, will we have to go over here and do this over and over to be able to get the shape? that sounds like a lot of work. And the answer to that is thankfully no. What we have to do here is we're going to do a different type of selection where we're going to use this point as a point that we're grabbing, but we're going to have influence on the other points to distort along with it. So the closer some of these points are, they're going to move close with this point, but the points that are far away are going to stay right here. How exactly do we do this? Well, this methodology is actually called soft selection. And the way that you get to this is you press the B key. As you can see, whenever you press the B key, you're seeing this kind of heat map where this is the hottest area and it becomes cooler and cooler until it gets to points where there's no influence. The cool thing about soft selection is that you're actually able to move this, and as you can see, other points are moving along with it depending on however closer they are to the point that you're selecting. So the points over here seem to be a lot closer over here, and they're moving more closer to this point than the other points which have less influence. So let's go ahead and escape back. And something we want to do is that we actually want to go ahead and increase the influence of this so that a lot of these points are actually being influenced by it. So the way that we do that is we press B, hold, and then click and drag to show how much influence should be on all these points. So I do know that I don't want these points to move really at all, but all these points over here, I definitely do want to move. So now that we have this influence set up, we can just go ahead and drag this. And as you can see, we're already getting a pretty good result as far as where things need to be. We can actually do the same over here to kind of get this kind of distortion by selecting these points, decreasing the influence, and moving it up. Now, as you can see, the influence over here is kind of unneeded, so I might have to move this down a little bit so that we can get more of a curvature. And this seems to work pretty well. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well I have this, but I want to actually not have the soft select influence, and I just want to work with the individual points. How do I do that? The way to do that is you press B again, and then you get to normal selection mode. So I can just move this up little by little, and we can get the same capabilities that we had before, soft select. Perfect. So we can actually just go ahead and use soft select now to be able to create the rest of this shape. The way that we can do this is we can go ahead and select this, and then select B, depending on whatever you want to, and then you can just move this all the way over here. Now when it comes to modeling, you don't have to be exactly perfect, but what we have to do is we want to make sure that we have enough influence over here to get an approximate shape. So once we move this over here, we can actually move this down. As you can see, we want to switch between these two modes depending on how the mesh is and depending on what level of manipulation that you want on this mesh. So now that we have created this plate right here, this seems to be looking exactly like the shape that we want it to be. Let's go ahead and adjust one more little thing right here, and yeah. So now let's go ahead and go back to object mode. And it seems like it's aligned really well with this exact shape. Now what I want to do now is I actually want to go ahead and go back into face mode instead of the vertex mode that we're working with. And what we want to do is we want to select all the faces that are here. Now, to know that you've selected faces, they'll turn orange. Now, what we want to do right here is we want to make this 2D plane with the shape into 3D. And the way that we'll be doing that is with extrusion. So to do this extrusion, I'm actually going to go back into perspective mode. As you can see, you have this little plane right here. So how do we extrude? The easiest way to extrude would probably be to go into Edit Mesh and then Extrude. And as you can see, the hotkey for this is Control E. But I'm going to teach you a much easier way to extrude. And the way that you do this is by pressing Shift, and as you're hovering right here, you can see that it says to extrude. And as you're holding Shift, you press this and push this forward. As you can see, we made a 2D object into a 3D object, and it seems to be working really well. So we just want to have a little bit of thickness to it right there. I think it should be in a good spot. Perfect, we have ourselves a nice little plate. It seems to work pretty well. Now, something that you've noticed right here is that in this back face, it seems to be having a weird shading issue. This right here is because of your normals. These faces right here are actually facing outwards, but this one is still facing inwards. So how do we fix this? So what we want to do here is we actually want to go ahead and flip the normals on these faces. How do we do that? We can just go ahead and select these one by one, but if you want an easier way to select a group of things or in a row of things, you want to shift, select on one, and then shift to your destination, and then double click. As you can see, it immediately fills that up. So we can just do the same right here. Perfect. We have ourselves all of our faces selected. And now what we want to do is we want to go to Mesh Display and then Reverse. And now, as you can see, it's actually facing the correct way, and we won't have any problems whenever we bring this into Unreal Engine. That is something to really note here. Maya can actually render two-sided meshes, but Unreal can't. Or at least it's not immediately allowed to by default. So whenever you bring in any sort of faces into Substance Painter or Unreal, where you're having this weird shading issue of the faces looking black, what would happen is in those programs, they would actually turn invisible because the faces are actually facing inward. This is why you want to fix these issues early on so that you won't have any problems in the future. So we have our plate right here, and it seems to be looking pretty well. Now, you can see that some of these edges right here seem a little jagged, and we want to keep these a little bit more smoother. How exactly are we going to be able to do that? Well, first thing we want to do is that we actually have to realize that we are right now in one mode. One mode right now is the current subdivisions of the polygon. But what we can do is that we can make these a lot smoother and have these points be more rounded by going into 3 mode. Now 3 mode right here essentially is the mode where you're doing a smooth mesh preview. So if I were to go ahead and take this mesh, and then if I were to go to mesh and then smooth, I would actually turn this into the same mesh that 3 mode is acting like. But the good news with 3 mode is that you're just getting a preview of this smooth mesh without actually having to apply it. So people always use 3 mode to be able to get a smoother preview. And this seems to work pretty well for our object. So if we were to go back over here, you can see that you're getting a lot more resolution and it's looking a lot more perfectly rounded where it needs to be. So you also want to make sure that there is a little bit of rigidity here. You don't want this to be completely curvy, but you want certain places to be a little bit more sharper. Like over here, we're seeing that we're losing a little bit of this. So how exactly do we do that? Well, the way that we do that is that we add something called edge loops. Edge loops are just loops in between. So right here, as you can see, if I were to select this edge and then shift double click along this next edge right here, what you'd realize that it's selecting a loop of vertices and edges that are traveling across this mesh. This is what you call an edge loop. And as you can see, we can do the same thing with faces as well. And this right here is also called a face loop. It's a very similar terminology, as you can see. Now, how do we add edge loops to this? Well, the way that you can add them is that you can actually go ahead and insert edge loop with a couple of different ways. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead to the multi-cut tool. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually create an edge loop over here. And the way that you can create an edge loop with a multi-cut tool is that you press Control, and then you can select where exactly you want this edge loop to be. And then you can just go ahead and press on where you want this edge loop. And as you can see already, whenever I added this edge loop right here, it's making this area a lot less smoother and making it more flatter. And we exactly kind of want this because this mesh should not exactly be super curvy around these edges right here. So this right here helps to add support. Now, one might be wondering, how exactly could I slide this edge loop so that it's closer to a certain mesh? So some people might be wondering, how do I take this edge loop right here and actually bring this closer to a certain edge if I wanted to? Well, the way that you can do that is that you're doing an operation called edge slide. And the easiest way to edge slide would be to select your edge loop, which is by shift and then double clicking on an edge to be able to select its loop. Next thing you want to do is you want to press shift and control. Next thing you want to do is you want to go ahead to the W key to be able to translate. So we're seeing our gimbal right here to translate this. And then we want to shift and then control to change this from extrude to slide. Now this edge slide right here, as you can see, is pulling this edge loop closer to other edge loops, depending on where you're moving this to. So if I were to move this over here, you can see that you're still having that rounded corner because of the smooth preview, but as it's getting closer and closer to this edge loop, you're getting more of a tightening, whereas over here, it's a lot more smoother. So that's what edge loops are mostly used for. In this case, they seem to be very useful in our purposes. So let's go ahead and add another edge loop over here by using the same methodology. So the same thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a multi-cut tool, go over here, and we're going to press Control, and then add an edge loop right there. Now this automatically places it to a place that it needs to be, but we can again make this even more tighter by going to the Translate tool, and then going ahead and shift selecting the edge loop. And then what we can do is, of course, press Shift and Control to be able to slide this edge and then keep this nice and tight. Now that we did this, we have ourselves our plate looking a lot more sharper, but also still curved around the edges, which feels like a more natural object. And right here, something to note is that we've actually created something called a bevel right here. A bevel is essentially two edge loops that support an existing edge loop to be able to create a sharp corner or edge that is still rounded, but not too rounded to where that there's no creasing happening over here. So now that we did this, we have ourselves our little plate. Let's go ahead and check how this looks over here. Now, something that we're seeing is that we actually want this area to be a little bit sharp. So we might have to select a certain edge loop to be able to do so. So let's actually move this into vertice mode. We're going to select these vertices. We're going to move this up, and then we are going to move it this way to get this to be a little bit more sharper. Now, something to note here is that we actually need a little bit of sharpness on this end because this is not as curved as the other parts of this. So how exactly am I going to be able to curve this area right here? Well, the way that we can do that is we can go to Edge Mode. We're going to go ahead and select these. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to Mesh Tools, and then we're going to use the Crease tool. Now, we've already selected our components, and it says we need to drag using middle mouse button to increase the crease. Now, as we increase this, you can see this is getting closer and closer to the 1-mode mesh instead of being like the 3-mode mesh. And this is why this tool is useful, because you can get a much sharper crease all the way over here. Let's select this and crease this up as well. And actually want to crease this up to somewhere over here so that we're getting something decent of a result. Now, something to note here is we actually want to make sure we select all the points that need to be creased, which should be all the way over here. So we select these, and then we can go over to your side mode, and then we middle mouse drag to get it more closer to the sharper corner. So now that we did this, we're getting a lot sharper of a hook right here. So this is why the crease tool can be extremely useful. And this is actually a tip that not even a lot of experienced modelers really know to use. Wonderful. So we have our shape, and it's looking pretty darn close to the reference that we have. So now that we have this completed, we actually want to make sure that we push this above the cylinder area like it is in the real mesh. So we're going to go over back here. We're going to go ahead and we're going to move this all the way over here and make sure that it's not intersecting. There's nothing wrong if it is, because it is just a model, but we want to just keep it nice and clean. And something that we realize is that if we were to go over here and go to this view, we actually see that there's 2 clamps. And so we want to make sure that these clamps are aligned, and we want to make sure that they're working. So let's go ahead and take this, and then we are going to Shift D to duplicate. We're going to go ahead and duplicate this all the way over here. Now we have ourselves a nice little shape right here that looks pretty accurate to what we want it to be. So now that we have duplicated our 2 plates right here, something to notice is that this top area, which we can go and see out here, if we were to hide this, which using H, you can see that there's a little bit of a bend right here and bend upwards for the form. So it seems to curve outward a little bit and then go back inward. So we want to make sure that we're getting this effect all the way here for both of these meshes. So how exactly are we going to be able to do that? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to go over here and then go to the back view. And what we want to realize is that we want to make sure that this curvature is happening over here and then ending back in here. So the way that we can do that is we can left click, go to edge mode, select a certain edge loop, and we have this edge loop selected. As you can see, we're able to move this with influence. Now, something important here to notice is that we're not wanting to move everything across this area. We just want to move a couple of vertices over here to be able to create this effect. So we just realized that they're actually not in this edge loop, but they're stuff over here that we actually have to move. So we're going to go ahead and create a little bit of influence in this area, move over here, and move to this area, and then move it up just a little bit. And this seems to give us a pretty accurate bend to what we want this object to be. We can select this area of influence, and then move it this way. And then what we want to do is we actually want to rotate this out just a little bit to create a little bit of that clamped bend look. Now we can go ahead and move this out just a little bit right there. And this seems to look a little bit more accurate to what we want it to be. We can left click and then object mode. Now, you can actually edit and do the same thing over here, but if we want to get this exactly matched along with this plate, something we can do is we can actually delete this duplication. We can go over here and then go to mesh, and then we can go to the mirror option. In the mirror option, we want to go ahead and press this box right here, and then we can actually set the axis of where we want to mirror. So in this case, we want to mirror it across the y-axis. So we can go ahead and select this, and then if we press mirror, we should be able to get a mirror. Now, we actually got this axis wrong, but we can actually go ahead and change this axis over here to X. And this seems to be the correct axis. So right here, we have a perfect copy and a mirror of this object. And we basically have it all in one mesh. So now that we got these clamps ready, if we were to go back here, you can see that it's looking pretty accurate to what we want it to be. Perfect. Now, you can see that there is some weird bends and distortions here. And this is why topology is very important. Ideally, we would want all of these to have loops going around this area, but the loops are going this way. So we might just have to correct this with a little bit of tweaking of the vertices. So we can just take some of these vertices and then bring them up just a little bit to get them a little bit closer. It's not a surefire way, and this is why topology is very important, because you can avoid issues like these. Now that we did this, we have a little bit more of a cleaner mesh right here. The other way to actually fix this issue as well is that you can go to the sculpting tool, and we can go to the smooth tool, and we can actually smooth this out. Now, something to realize is that the smooth tool seems very strong. So how exactly do we keep this in the influence that it's a little bit less stronger? The way to do this is that we do the same thing with soft select, which is where we press B and then scale it all down. As you can see, it seems like the brush is really big, so you actually want to scale this down to something a lot smaller, and then smooth it out by pressing on the area that you wanted to smooth out. This seems to be a lot more cleaner than we had it before. Sculpting is the other workflow to be able to create more complicated mesh, and sculpting can also be used to fix certain problems with certain meshes. So we're actually doing that right now, and it seems to be working pretty well. Perfect. So now we have ourselves the perfect kind of mesh that we want to have for this project. So let's go ahead and escape from it. Let's go back to object mode, and we can see that we've created this clamp right here for this area. We want to actually create these other clamps as well, so let's go ahead and get started on that. The same steps that we showed before are going to be applied to all of these, so I'm just going to go ahead and speed through and model these assets. So what I did here is the same steps where I took a cube instead of a plane so that we don't have to do the normal fixing issues. Take a cube, go ahead and place it over here, align this to this kind of rectangle orientation, and then go over here and then making sure that it's not looking like a classic cube where it's the same width as this length right here. And so I actually shortened this width down so that it looks like a plate. And then right now we're going to figure out how to go ahead and model this little area right here. We're going to be doing the same thing, but as you can see, we don't actually have the same amount of subdivisions here as we did with the plane. So we're going to go ahead and add a bunch of edge loops. So let's go ahead and do that. So I take the multi-cut tool, we're going to go ahead and control, and then we're going to add an edge loop right here. We also want to make sure that we have an edge loop right here so that we're aligning with the center of this area. we're going to go ahead and want an edge loop all the way over here. And then add some supporting loops in here. We want to go ahead and add a loop over here, and a loop over here. Now, I'm adding loops in very specific places. I'm actually adding it right here so that we can actually push this mesh up a little bit. I'm adding some support loops over here to kind of hold the topology correctly. So make sure that whenever you're adding loops that you don't add too much and go overboard, that you only do the ones that you need. Next thing we want to do is we want to take this vertex right here, move this up, this area, move this vertex up all the way over there, and kind of match the shape of what we want to get. As you can see, because we put our edge loops in certain places, we're getting to this result a lot quicker than if we were to just work with a bunch of edge loops that were already created for us. Something important to make sure to do as well is making sure that your points in here are not just all compressed out in the middle, but we actually move some of these points out so that everything with the topology holds a little bit more evenly and that there's enough creasing happening on the edges so that it's not all super rounded. So we're just going to move a bunch of this out. Okay, so this seems to be all perfectly aligned as we wanted it to be. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and select this object, go into 3 mode, and as you can see, we still have a bunch of places that we want to correct. One right here is that I definitely want an edge loop here to tighten up this area. So we're going to go ahead and go to edge mode, go to the multi-cut tool, and then select control, and then add an edge loop right here. And as you can see, it's already feeling a lot tighter. I want to go ahead and select this vertex right here, and then press B, and then move it up just a bit to get this aligned. I'm going to do the same thing over here. And then we're going to continue putting this until we get to a really good spot with our mesh. So this right here is the basics of a lot of modeling. And we basically have this covered already with just a couple of steps. Now, of course, we need to do the same thing that we did with the other plates below, which is that we add holding edges to the edge right here so that it's not super rounded like clay. So the way that we do that is, of course, we add more edge loops. Go ahead and take the knife tool. Go ahead and press Control. We're going to add one really close over here. We're going to add another one more closer to this edge right there. Perfect. So now we have everything aligned, and just very quickly, we basically created this little object already. Nice and sharp, but also nice and rounded. The other thing we want to do is we actually want to slide these edges because they're feeling just a tad bit too tight. So of course, the way that we do that is we go ahead and edge select, and then select your translation tool, and then Control and Shift to be able to slide it. We're sliding it right there. We're going to slide it this way, and also make sure that you're only selecting the edge loop that you need to slide. And then this seems, you can add a little bit more tightness over here. And this seems to be a pretty darn good plate. And we've already finished this really quickly. So we have one more plate to do, and I think this one should be pretty simple and straightforward. So let's get going with this one. Same thing, we're going to go ahead and select a cube. Going to move this up. And then we're going to make this into a kind of triangle. So I'm going to keep this right there, and then I'm going to go ahead and scale up this cube. Move this up over here. We're going to go ahead and go to vertex, and then we're going to put this one all the way over here, put this one all the way over here, put this one all the way over here, and put this one all the way over here. Let's actually push this over here. Awesome. Next thing we want to do is, of course, we want to go ahead and subdivide, and the way that we do that is, of course, with the knife cut tool. Take the knife tool, go ahead and select this knife tool right here, and then we're going to control. As you can see, we're seeing an edge loop appearing. We're going to put one over here. We're going to put one over here to round this area out. We're going to do supporting loops going across this place. Perfect. And then we want to do an edge loop over here, probably 2 edge loops over here. We can actually get away with 1, but I just want to keep 2 to make this nice and clean. So now that we have this, we're going to go ahead and go to object mode, select this into 3 mode. As you can see, we're already getting the shape. Let's go ahead and add some more steps right here. And right now we're still in knife tool, so let's actually go back. We're going to select these points, B, soft select, and then we're going to translate this to get this more corrected. We're going to take this point right here and definitely move this up above so that we're getting the correct rounded shape. Same thing over here. So we want to get this nice and round. Then we just want to keep moving points and moving stuff with soft select and with that soft select so that we're getting the correct shape. Take this, move this all the way down over here. Awesome. We got our shape. Something to notice is that this shape seems to be pretty rounded. So let's actually go back and see why that's the case. And we realize it's actually because the extrusion seems to be a lot bigger than the other one. So you can see why that this place is actually kind of rounded. It's because we have a very thick kind of cube that we never actually pushed forward. So we need to actually select all of these points right here. So let's go ahead and go to vertice mode, select the points, and then push them in. As you can see, we kind of missed a point right there. That's why it's super important to make sure that your points are all being selected and then push them in. We're getting a nice little plate right there. Oh, we missed another point. Perfect. Now that we got this, we again want to make sure that we have holding edges so that it's not as round. So the way that we do that, of course, is we go to our knife tool again, and then we want to add another edge loop. So right here, one over here, and then one over here. And something important to note here is, again, the more edge loops you had, the more tighter that area gets and the more creased it becomes, which is actually the exact effect that we want. So this is great for us. Perfect. Let's go ahead and go back, make a couple of adjustments to make sure that everything is still looking pretty good. It seems to have a little bit of distortion, so I'm going to move ahead. I'm going to go ahead and move a couple of these vertices down below. As you can see, modeling is a very exact process and it takes a little bit of time, but once you figure it out, it actually is not as bad. Just still moving a lot of points, extrusions, and scaling. Sweet. So we have ourselves our 2 plates that we need to do extra on top of this one. And so just like with this one right here, we want to make sure that there are actually 2 plates and that they're aligned in the correct spot. So first thing we want to do is we want to go over here, go to this view, and then we want to figure out where this area would be. So this would actually be kind of aligned very similar to over here. As you can see, the scaling seems to be a little bit off compared to the other plates. So I'm just going to go ahead and scale this way. our pivot point's here, which is why it's scaling here. So we can just kind of move this over here. And then we can just go ahead and mirror this just like the last one. So we can go over here to mesh, mirror, and then make sure that this is in the x-axis. And whenever we mirror it, we have ourselves our nice little mirror. Now, to make sure that this mirror is aligned correctly with what we want it to be, you can go ahead and push this inward over here and get this to the correct spot. And then go back to object mode. Same thing we want to do over here. Go ahead and you can just select object mode right here, and then we can go to mesh, we can go to mirror, and actually we can put our offset of how we want this to be mirrored. So we can actually offset it just a tad bit below. Let's go ahead and put the offset to -0.1. Let's see what happens. And start mirroring it. It seems to be pretty close to it. So we can go ahead and select these faces and align them correctly. Wonderful. So we have all these aligned pretty close to the place that we want them to be. And we are in a pretty good spot. So if we were to go over here, we see that we have our base for our lamp, and we're already off to a really, really good start. And we actually got some very complicated pieces out of all this done in a very short span of time. All right, so this next part is actually gonna be pretty simple. It's gonna be a little recap of how to do primitives and scaling them and extruding them. So this part should be relatively simple. All we're doing is making a cube, moving it out over here. And then all we're gonna be doing is we're gonna go ahead and make sure that this cube is the correct length that we want it to be. It seems like it's already in the correct length, so we can actually keep this wherever we need to keep it. And we can't exactly see where this cube is, so I'm actually gonna go ahead and move this up. Now, something to note right here is that if I were to rotate this cube, that this axis, whenever I rotate it, is feeling this way. And you can actually scale it in this way, whereas with translation, it seems to be locked to what the world is. What exactly this is that the axis of which you're rotating and translating and scaling are different. So right now, translation is on world scale. So it's going to be aligned to the exact way that you have this axis right here. Whereas if I were to go to rotation mode, you're actually seeing that it's being aligned with the place that the rotation of the cube is. So in this case, our z-axis is this way, our y-axis is this way, and our x-axis should be going towards us. So the way to actually get and change this to feel like it's translating in the correct way, so instead of going from global, we want to move this into a local axis. The way to do so is we actually want to hold onto whatever translation, rotation, or scaling that you're planning to do. So for example, we want to change the translation to local axis. The way that you do that is you press W, and then left click drag, you press W, and then you right click drag into object. And as you can see, immediately it changed the axis from the world axis to local axis. So now if we were to move this, we can move this literally along this area, which is really, really cool. So we can just move this all the way over to over here. And then we can actually move this all the way down here. And now we can actually go ahead and scale from this area all the way up over here. So for this, I'm actually not going to scale it. I'm actually going to go ahead and extrude it now. So if I were to go over here, if I were to select this mesh, go back, and then go over here, and then press extrusion, which would again be taking this and then pressing shift. We're going to extrude this little by little. Keep extruding. And extrude it up. Perfect, we got our extrusions done. Seems to be pretty simple. Now, we actually want to do the same thing over here, and the way that we can do this is, again, we can just go to object mode, and then duplicate, move it up over here, and then align it closely. We can just put that right there. And it's okay if it's intersecting a little bit, or if it's not exactly perfect, it doesn't need to be. All it has to be is it's close and it actually shows the form of the object itself. Now, with an object like these two, you actually don't want to move this into 3 mode because you really don't need that extra detail. And also, if I were to move this into 3 mode, it would kind of look like this, which is kind of a very smooth and rounded selection. And we don't necessarily want that, and we actually don't need to worry about adding holding edges. So we're just going to keep this in 1 mode, just like most of these objects are. What we do want to do, though, is that we want to add a little bit of beveling to it. And the way that we do that is we go to Mesh. Actually, and the way that we do that is we're going to select these two, go over here, go to Bevel. And it seems like you can't really bevel with multiple objects, so we're just going to select one of them. So the way that we do that is we're going to select one of these objects. We're going to go over here to Edit Mesh, and then we're going to select Bevel. As you can see, whenever we bevel a little bit, it seems to add some edges. It seems to change the edge and add a little bit of segments to it. So if I were to increase the bevel, this is what it would be looking like. So what we're going to do is we're just going to keep one segment right here, and we're going to change the fraction so that we're having a little bit of holding edges happening on the edge. We're going to do the same thing over here. We're going to go ahead to Edit Mesh, Bevel, and then we're getting the bevel right here. We're going to change the fraction so that it's a little bit smaller. And we got the same type of curvature happening here as you would find in a real world object. Something really important for a lot of beginner modelers to know is that no object is ever as sharp and straight as it would be in CG. It always has a little bit of a bevel, so make sure to bevel your edges. So now that we did this, we have ourselves a nice little bevel. Now, if we were to take this and move this into 3 mode, you can see that it's looking a lot more closer to what we want it to be as sharp objects. Now, we'll still keep this in 1 mode, so let's go ahead and put these back in 1 mode. We can also add more divisions in here and add another edge loop, but I'm actually going to keep these as is. Awesome. So now that we have these 2 bars right here, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to duplicate these bars to put on this side. We're going to Shift D, and then right now we're just going to move this up over here, but as you can see, we just want to rotate this so that it's looking this way. So we can just rotate this way, and actually move this down a little bit. And move this bar all the way over there. And then we just want to duplicate this again, and we want to rotate it this way and get this nice and aligned. Awesome. Well, it seems like we're well on our way to be actually finishing this lamp relatively easily. Now, we do see that there's some parts, some clamps and stuff that aren't exactly aligned to where we want them to be. So we want to go ahead and fix that up. That's why we want to make sure we check everything in perspective mode and make sure everything is where it needs to be so that all the elements fit together and make sense. So now we got our base shape for our lamp. Now the next thing we want to do is we actually want to go ahead and add these springs, which are the next big element of this lamp. So you might be wondering, how exactly are you going to be creating a very complicated spiral structure like the spring right here? Well, the good news is you actually don't have to, because even though you can't see it here in the poly modeling section, if we were to go to the platonic solid section and then left click and hold, you can actually see that there's extra prisms and pyramids and other primitives that you can use to be able to create more complicated objects. Right here, we actually have something called a helix, which is basically, at the end of the day, a little bit of a spring. And actually, you can control a lot of these helix properties if you were to go to polyhelix in this section of the attribute editor. And so you can increase the number of coils, you can increase the width, the height, the radius, all the parameters that you'd want it to be. Let's go ahead and push this up. And then we're going to go ahead and rotate and align this with the spring that is here. As you can see, we actually want a lot more coils. So we're going to coil this up to 20. We can actually move this up to 50, I think would be a pretty good spot to be in. We're going to increase the height And it seems like the width might be related to the width of the entire thing. The radius seems to be really big, so we're actually going to make this radius a little bit smaller. So it seems like the radius should be around 0.1. Seems to be a pretty good spot to be. We're going to rotate this out. And then we're actually going to scale this down just a little bit. And we're already getting somewhere really, really close. Go ahead and move this up. And then rotate it around again. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go over here and then push this out so that it's sitting on top of over here. And the other thing we can actually do is we can go ahead and rotate this just a tad bit this way so that it seems like there's tension on here. Wonderful. And then the other thing we want to do, of course, is we're going to go ahead and Shift D, duplicate, and then keep it right there. As you can see, we have this little rotation this way, so we want to actually rotate it the other way. Wonderful. We have our nice little coil and spring, and then we want to do this exact same thing up on top. So we're just going to take this right there, go back into our side view, and then we're going to Shift D and duplicate both of these, and then rotate them, and then scale them up. And then keep them and align them to the place where they need to be. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly could I see the reference image seeping through here? And the way that you can do that is you can go to View, and you can go to Shading, and then you can click X-Ray, where you can actually see more of this. So we'll just go ahead and keep X-Ray. We can actually put this on wireframe too, to be able to see everything in wireframe and align with any sort of object that you want. So as you can see, we actually want to scale this down a little bit over here. And then rotate this and get this nice and aligned. And once we do these adjustments, we should be in a pretty good spot. Now we want to go ahead and go back to shading, make sure it's smooth shade all, so you can see our objects looking like. It seems to be looking pretty good. Now, we do want to push these out just a little bit and actually turn down the rotation of them because these seem to be pretty straight. Perfect. All right, so now that we have our major components of our lamp kind of done, we can actually go ahead and start getting on to the little details. So the way that we're going to be doing that is we're going to go ahead and create the little screws, as we can see right here. So, of course, a screw at the end of the day is just a little screw head that should be some sort of half sphere with a little bit of a notch for where the screwdriver would go in. So we just have to create one of those, and then we can just duplicate that and then add that to other parts. So let's go ahead and get that started. Let's go over to the side panel right here, and let's make one of these screws. So we're going to do that by first taking a sphere, and then we're going to chop it in half. Let's go ahead and do that right now. So if we go to face mode, and we can actually go over to this section right here. We can go to the back view, and then we're going to select this half right here, then press delete. And then we want to make sure something really important right here. So we want to make sure that our shading right here is on X-ray, just so we can actually see if everything is getting selected. So it didn't seem like everything was. So now, if you can go ahead and select from right there, we just have a perfect selection, delete it, and then we should be good. Awesome. So if we were to look at this, this is perfectly where we want it to be. And so we can then go ahead to object mode. We're we're going to go ahead and scale this down a little bit and then move this to one of the screw locations. So let's go ahead and do that to this bottom screw right there. Move this up and then move it this way. And then we are going to scale this down just so that it fits in right where we want it to be. So it seems like the screw was right around there, which I think should be pretty darn good. Okay, we're going to do something real quick. We're going to go ahead and hide this right there, just so we can see a little bit of a reference of how the screws are kind of constructed. A lot of this screw right here is kind of hidden because it's getting hit by light as a metallic object. So we can actually undo that and find a screw where it's a little bit more visible. So this right here seems to be a little bit more visible. You can see that because of the image quality, it's going to be kind of hard to really get all the details of it, but basically this one is a Phillips head, which just kind of has like a cross indentation in here. So we're just gonna have to make that. So if you were to take a look at our little screw object right here, which right now actually we can just select from here, let's actually go ahead and make sure that this is on the outside looking this way. So we're gonna push this right there. And so we have our little object right there. And it seems to be smooth shaded, which is exactly what we want it to be. We can go ahead and put this in 3 mode as well, because we want to really add a lot of detail to this. Go back to our side view, and now we're going to go ahead and cut this up to be able to create this kind of square pattern. So we're going to take, what we're going to do is we're going to actually cut another edge loop right here in the center so that we can get the exact kind of, the exact width correctly. We also want to do the same over here as well so that we can actually have control over it. So of course, we're going to go ahead and go to our trusty little multi-cut tool, go to control, and then we're going to add a edge loop probably right around here. We're going to do the same amount right there. I think this was around, and then we're actually wanting to keep it somewhere around there. And this seems to be a pretty small, a pretty correct area of where we want it to be. We can actually go ahead and slide these edges up a little bit. So I'm actually going to use the edge mode, double click, and then we're going to do our shift and control. I'm going to slide this out just to get it a little bit more precise. Same thing here, shift, double click, triple click, take this, slide. And so I think we're getting to a pretty decent notch right there. So we want to also do this exact same step this way. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Same thing, control. And then we want to put this up right around here. And then another edge loop right around there. Awesome. And then yeah, we have a nice little star pattern that's starting to form right here. Let's go ahead and put this in 3 mode. As you can see, it's not exactly what we want it to be, so we're going to put this back in 1 mode. And then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and select the faces that we want to be able to delete for this pattern. So we zoom back out. Let's go ahead and zoom back in. Put this right there. Select up until wherever we want it to end. So actually, I'd rather want it to end right around there. So this is what, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It would go all the way out here. So we're just going to go ahead and go to 4 to kind of keep it a little bit more even, because I don't think the subdivisions are exactly accurate. So this should be fine for now. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 on this side. And so it seems like actually this doesn't feel completely even either, so we're going to go ahead and delete some. The way I'm deleting some of this selection is by pressing Control, and then as you can see there's a negative sign, so we can kind of dial it down even more to what we need it to be. So it seems like we might have to add one more over here. And yeah, this looks like a pretty solid selection. If you want to get the same kind of curvature here, we can obviously dial down these edges to kind of make them a little bit more smaller. So we do this, and then we can decrease the length right there, and that should be good enough for what we're trying to go for. And yeah, this should be good. So let's go ahead and go to faces, and then you can see our selection is still being recorded right here. So all we have to do now is we're going to extrude inside. So the cool thing about extrusion is that, well, you can extrude outside as well. You can do the same inside. So let's go ahead and get that going. So to do this, we're going to go over to our perspective mode. We're going to move over here. We're going to take our translation. We're going to select Control. We're going to select Shift. Then we're going to extrude inward. As you can see, you're basically getting a nice little extrusion inside where we created this nice little hole, this kind of divot, to be able to work with. So with a lot of these screws, the hole goes very far in, so we can just kind of put this in right here. And then what we're going to do is actually we're going to add some more supporting edge loops on this side using the multi-cut tool, because this will come in handy later whenever we're moving to 3 mode. So we're just going to add some supporting edge loops here. So go ahead and put Control, put one over there, and then put one over there. And so we have a lot of support inside here now, which should be really good for us. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and move to object mode, and we're going to press 3 to see how it's looking. So it seems to be having some support in here, but we're losing a lot of form. So we're going to have to put this in 1 mode again, and then we're going to see how we can make sure that this is not being too distorted. The big thing I'm seeing right now is that there's not really an edge loop on the outside, so we're going to go ahead and use the multi-cut tool to be able to add that into the edges. So we're going to go ahead and press we're going to go ahead and press Shift right there, add one over there, add an edge loop close over here, do the same thing over here, so add one over here, and then this one should be able to have support. So if I were to press 3, it's looking a little bit more tighter and a little bit more of what we exactly want. Now, while these supporting edge loops do seem to work, we could obviously make them even more sharper around certain places. So the thing that we can do is that we can add creasing to it. And we talked about creasing earlier, so what we have to do is we have to go over here, select the edges that you want to crease, which would be this one, and we don't necessarily have to crease this one right there. We can just use this one, and then we can go to Mesh Tools, then we can use the Crease tool, and then we've already selected the components, and then we're going to middle mouse and then drag it out. And just it seems to be creasing just a little bit, so we're going to go ahead and select some more right there. And actually, let's go ahead and select this edge loop and this edge loop and to crease. And I think this should help us a lot. And then also these internal edge loops as well. This is a little bit annoying because these are not exactly complete loops, as you can see, which is why having good edge loops is super important. You won't always get them, but like you should try to get them as best as you can. But topology really helps here, because if they were actually in like a perfect loop, we'd be able to select this a lot quicker. So it actually helps with your workflow as well. So now that we have these, let's go ahead and use the crease tool, move them out a little bit. As you can see, it seems to be creasing a little bit better. So this should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and go to object mode and see how this looks. And yeah, this looks pretty darn okay. It could be better more on the edges, so let's see if we can add another edge loop around the edge right there to kind of help with that. So we go into our knife tool. We're going to go ahead and press Alt Shift, add one over there, and then that seems to kind of sharpen it up just a little bit. That right there. And same thing over here up top. Perfect. And same thing down in the bottom. Perfect. And then we want to do the same internally as well. So let's put this one right there. Then this one right there, very close to it. Another one right here, nice and close. And then another one right here. Perfect. So now that we did this, this should look a lot sharper. And yes, it does. It definitely does look a lot sharper. Now I might be seeing that there's some weird shading issues here, because like the crease seems to be a little too close, so we can always untighten that. So we can just go over here and select this edge loop right here. And then we're going to go ahead and slide it around a little bit. So of course we can select this, go to Shift and Control, select those, and then slide it just a little bit so it's not too tight. Same thing here. And then we want to slide it around. There we go. And slide it up a little bit. And then actually we want to make sure that it's actually the entire loop. So let's go ahead and select all of that. shift, slide up. Same thing up here. Go ahead and slide up. Perfect. I think this should get us to a pretty darn good spot. And yeah, while it's not perfect, doesn't need to be, I think it's looking pretty darn close. We can obviously keep this in 1 mode if we wanted to, and it would look fine, but I actually kind of like the 3 mode now. So we'll keep this in 3 mode. I think it's good enough detail for what we want. We actually can see that this feels a little bit too big, like the actual structure itself. So let's go ahead and use soft select to be able to take all of this and actually make this a little bit smaller. So we're gonna go ahead and actually what we can do is we can go ahead and select, we can box select all these vertices. So let's go ahead and shift, select all of this, shift, select all of this, shift, select all of this, and then select all of those right there. So as you can see, it's not fully selecting. So what we can do is we can just like add to it by doing Control and Shift and then selecting all, and then it's just adding to the selection. And then what we can do is we can press B and we can turn up the influence. So it seems like the influence is a little big already. So once we do this, we can go ahead and just scale it in just a little bit. Now it does seem to be distorting out in the edges, so we want to bring the influence down just a little bit, keep this very subtle. And right now it does seem to be scaling internally, so we might just want to be careful about how we're scaling this. So scaling in this way shouldn't work, so we can just scale it down. Oh, I see a big thing right here. Some of this stuff got selected, so we want to deselect all that, deselect anything here, and now it seems to be a lot better. So we can actually also flatten this as well, so making this a little bit flatter, scaling it this way, and that seems to kind of help a little bit. And then once we scale this down a little bit, we can actually push it more up further, and then we can go back, and actually I think I'm going to reduce the scaling as much as possible. And scale it down now, and it should be a little bit less problematic. Cool. So yeah, this seems to be a pretty darn good screw. It's good enough for our purposes. It's nothing fancy. It can just do the job. And also, we see that there's a couple of these pinching areas, and we could probably fix that with a little bit of sculpting. So what I like to do is I like to take this, B, and then keep holding B, and then make this flatter. You can use the relax tool. That's another tool that you can use to be able to have things be relaxed. But I'm actually going to go ahead, oh yeah, this is the relax tool right here. You can use that to relax your edges, keep them a little bit more smooth and flattened right there. It's pretty good. Reduces the pinching on these areas. And this seems to work a lot better right there. So now that we got these relaxed, I think this is looking pretty darn good. Awesome. And then now the shading looks a lot better. We can actually relax a little bit of this area right here. So we go right there, and relax this area. Okay, wonderful. So as you can see, we used a little bit of sculpting, a lot of polygonal modeling, and then we got this nice little screw right there. Now, all we have to do is, we just have to duplicate this all across the board. It's that simple. So right here we got this sphere, and then we're going to Shift D. We're going to go ahead and take this and then move this up to the place that it needs to be. And so that we're going to do that, we're going to go ahead and go to the side mode, place this right there, Shift D. And as you can see, something to note is that whenever you do a command, and whenever you were to do the command again, it'll actually remember what parameters you used and moved it by, and actually keep that right there. This could be very useful if you're trying to make an array of things, but for now we can actually just move it back to the place that we need it to be. So we can just move this right there. Awesome. And then the next thing we can do too is we can go ahead and duplicate all of this to move all these over here. And actually right here, it only seems to have 2 screws right there. So we can just go ahead and just duplicate this. Now, something important to note is that these screws seem to be a little bit different. They seem to have not really a place to like turn anything, but I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate these instead, because I just think it's a lot more easier to work with, and honestly we don't really need a lot of the other, we don't need to model a whole separate screw or anything like that. We can just reuse it. As a modeler, you can make decisions like that, and I think it's totally fair to be able to do so, because you don't have to model everything exactly the same way that you want it to be. You can take shortcuts, and as long as it's not going to be hurting anyone else in the process, any sort of like surfacing or anything like that, it should be mostly fine. And this is a pretty normal decision that you can make right here. That's not really going to add any problems. So you can just put this here, and then Shift-D, move this over here, and then Shift-D. It seems to be moving all the way over there. Put this back here, and then Shift-D, and then I think we're going to put the last one. Is there a screw over here? Okay, I don't think there is a screw over there, so we can just actually delete this. And there seems to be a screw over here, but we're going to ignore that one for now. So we're just worried about the main screws that you can see over here. Awesome. So now let's go over to this back view right here and make sure everything is where it's supposed to be. And it seems to be in the correct place because we put it on top of meshes that we already had. So it should be looking pretty okay. I just actually see that this one right here is a little bit tilted this way, and like we actually want to make sure that it's nice and straight, and push this in a little bit. Okay, there we go, we fixed that. Awesome. And so now if we were to go back, you see we have all of these wonderful little screws that are helping support our model, and we already added so much detail to this. Cool. So this right here should be pretty good as far as getting us closer and closer to our actual result. Next thing we want to do, of course, is we want to actually go ahead and create this little knob. And again, we're using the exact same principles that we learned before. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to create, let's actually go into side view mode and see how it's actually constructed. As you can see, all it is, if we were to hide this right now, all it is really just a nice little like Y shape with a little bit of a sphere head on top. And actually this will be very useful for us to be able to realize how we can actually create this little circular shape right here from a shape like this, which is going to be really cool. So I'm going to teach y'all how to do that. So with this one, we can approach this many different ways as to how to start a complicated object like this. I think the best way that we can actually work with this is that we're going to create a create a cube, and then we're going to use that to be able to create these spokes using extrusions. So let's go ahead and get that started. What we're going to do right now is we're going to go to Poly Modeling tab. We're going to create a cube. And I think a lot of items can actually be created by cubes. So if you're in doubt about like what primitive to use to get started with a couple of objects, I would highly recommend the cube. You can never go wrong with the cube. So you might be wondering where our cube is. So we can just go over here. You can find this in the hierarchy, and then move this out so that we can actually see our cube right there. We can actually push this up further so that we can actually have a nice little view of everything, and then put this over here, and then move this over there. So right now, we actually want to move this back into place so that we don't have any issues there. That should be good. And our cube is going to be right there. So we're going to take this cube, I'm going to put this right there, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide this so that we can see what we're doing. I'm just going to go ahead and hide this and this as well. And we're just going to focus on the shape right there. Now, this knob is turned, there's also another one of these over here, but as you can see, they're all turned in a weird angle. So we should probably go ahead and rotate this cube right now. Let's go ahead and rotate this. And then we're going to move this over here, rotate, and then we're going to go ahead and scale it. And right now I'm using the local axis, by the way, for those of you who don't know. I'm going to go ahead and select vertex, select this, and then what we're going to do is we're actually going to put this over here, because what we're making right now is a little bit of a triangle, so that we can actually extrude out of here for these different shapes and get them correct. So we're actually going to put this one right there, and then put this one right there. And want to make this equilateral as much as we can. So kind of put this close to here, put this a little bit close to here. Yeah, this seems to be pretty decent. It's a little isosceles, but that's not a problem. We can go ahead and actually add some divisions now. So let's go ahead and add some divisions here. Actually, what we can do now is we can actually do the extrusion and then add divisions. So let's go ahead and go into, oh no, why is this happening? Okay, so let's go ahead and go into the faces that are here. So we're gonna go over here, we're gonna select this face, and right now we're in soft select mode, we're gonna take that off, select this face, and we're gonna select this face. And then what we wanna do is we actually wanna extrude out of this. Now, something important to note is that we're not actually extruding out of a very specific axis. We have to do this all simultaneously. So for an extrusion like this, I would actually recommend going into mesh tools or going into edit mesh and then doing the extrusion here. Because what we'll do is that we'll be able to extrude from over here and do offsets and twists and things of that sort. Let's go ahead and extrude this. And whenever you do this, you just have to realize you're actually extruding on each face's individual axes. So that's the good thing about this right here. So I'm able to extrude these, and it is looking like a little bit of a weird shape, but we can obviously go ahead and modify those points right there. And so you're actually translating in their local Z axis. And you can also do like offsets and stuff. This is basically the same as scaling across their board, but this should be fine for now. Let's go ahead and change this into, it seems to be using the image plane. Go ahead. So we go ahead and change this to vertex mode. Go ahead and put this over there and get this big shape right here down. Now something to note right here is that we might need a division across this plane because I don't think this one extruded properly. But we'll just work with these for now. And then we might have to delete some faces and things of that sort, which that is okay. So yeah, as we can see, this area did not actually get properly extruded. So we're going to go ahead and actually, we're going to go back to our motor over here, and we're actually going to keep this as a, so because this didn't get extruded properly, we're actually going to go back and then redo the extrusion. This is why it's super important to realize, like, okay, which faces are actually being extruded right now, because technically these didn't get extruded properly. So we're going to go ahead and hit Control E this time for the extrusion. And as you can see, this one is being extruded properly because it's putting separate faces, but these aren't. So I think the move to do right now is actually we should probably do something called a bevel. So bevel is the same as adding holding edges to an edge right here, but it's a little bit more different because you're actually splitting this edge apart into two edges. So in this instance, a bevel would actually be the best move to do. So we have this. Let's go to Edit Mesh, and there should be a bevel tab. You see how this kind of has this bevel, kind of like what we have right here. So this kind of did it automatically. So we can decide how long we want our bevel to be. And I think this will be helpful for actually doing this transition properly. Next, what we want to do, select these faces again. And then now we want to Control E and extrude out of here. And now we're getting the shape properly to the way that we want it to be. So that's the thing about modeling, is that it actually can be a lot of problem solving. But if you know the techniques and if you know which tools you have in your tool belt, you should be able to figure it out relatively easily. So now we have all these points and this proper extrusion right here. So now we can just go ahead and modify our points to get them to at least the shape that we want it to be. So this one right here is going this way. And then this right here is kind of the width of this one. You can move these over here. And we can add divisions here to add these curves. So now we can actually go ahead and do edge loops. So go to our multi-cut tool, and then Alt, and then actually we can do Control over here, add an edge loop there, add an edge loop there, and then add an edge loop there. Now, something you might be noticing here is that you're actually creating an n-gon in this area, because this is actually not just the face that we had before with 4 sides, but there's actually, because of the points here, you're creating an n-gon. So we have to actually solve this problem right here and see how we can actually get this fixed. So I think the best solution for this would be to make this into a quad. So we can actually use the multi-cut tool here and then press enter. And then what we want to do is we might want to solve this area out with quads. So this is actually a very interesting problem. what we might have to do is we might have to actually put like a little point here, add this, and then take this, and then put it here, and then put this, and then connect this one over there, and then we might have to find a way to connect these two. This is kind of what makes modeling a little bit hard, is to fix topology problems. So the other thing we can do too is, instead of just adding one here, we can add two here so that it's more even. So let's go ahead and add an edge loop here. So we're going to add one here, and then one over here as well. Same thing here. One over here, one over here as well. One over here, one over here as well. And then I think now it should be able to translate between these edge loops a little bit more cleaner than it was before. Then move across here. And so let's go ahead and enter this, and then let's try to connect these over here. And then connect this one over here. Perfect. So now we got all quads, and we actually were able to fix this issue. This is exactly what we want, and this is great. Now we can go ahead and do the fun part of just moving around vertices. So go ahead and take this out, move this over here, move this over here, and we actually want to move this down over here, and then probably move this a little bit here for the curvature on this end. And again, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but it just has to be close enough to where you're getting this in the most accurate sense. So we put this over here, and then put this over here. Yeah, I think this looks pretty darn close. We might actually have to move this up just a little bit because I think it's not as even. And getting a little bit closer and closer. Move this right there. I think this might be a little bit below, so we're going to put this over there. There we go. And yeah, I'd say this is pretty darn close enough. Let's actually go ahead and push this over there, increase the length just a little bit. Okay, I think this seems like a pretty solid base right here to work with. And then this should be good. Awesome. So now comes the big question of how are we going to get this circle around here? Now, I think the easiest method to do this would be to actually just get a half circle or get a circle right here and just extrude. But I actually want to show y'all a neat little trick called circularize. Now, what exactly is the circularize? Well, the thing is, you can actually turn a face right here, depending on if it has a lot of sides, you can actually turn that into a circle. So before we do this, we want to make sure we actually have enough divisions to be able to create a circle here. So one thing I'm noticing is that we might want to have an edge loop right here. So we're going to add that in there. So that's good. And then the other thing we might want is we might want an edge loop right here. And then we can obviously add also some extra edge loops here. Shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, this should be good. Okay. And then, actually, let's make sure this is correct. Okay, this looks good. And then what we want to do is we want to select a couple of faces. So we want to select this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. So we have something of a circle right here, and I think this should be good enough. And then what you do is you go to Mesh, and then there is an option out here in Edit Mesh called Circularize. And whenever we take this option, you can see you actually turned a bunch of these very square topology right here, and we turned them into a circle. It's actually really, really, really cool of a tool. Not a lot of people really know about this tool, but I find this to be really, really important to have if you want to make any sort of holes or any sort of extrusions that are coming off from a cubic model into kind of a circular model. In Blender, this option is called Spherize, but here this is called Circularize. So this seems to work pretty well. We can go ahead and move over here, and we can see how perfectly it turned everything into a wonderful little circle right there. Now, these are still not actually, these are still quads, they're just a little compressed around here. So let's go ahead and move some of these edge loops out. We're actually going to go ahead and slide them. So Shift Control, slide, and it should be good. Okay, there we go. So yeah, as you can see, these are not actually triangles. So we should be fine. We should be good to go. We just have to slide them get them out of the way so that we don't have any problems. Awesome. So this seems to be looking pretty good. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to take this circle right here, and now we can finally extrude this, no problem. So you can go ahead and press Shift, and then extrude out. Perfect. And we're going to go ahead and Shift, extrude out once more. And now with this extrusion, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and scale it. And then this creates a nice little curvature. I want to go ahead and Shift, extrude, and scale this again. So Shift, so go ahead and put the translate, Shift, extrude, and then scale once more. Then we have a nice little transition right here. So yeah, this is looking pretty darn close to what we want this to be. So this seems to be looking pretty good. I think this edge right here might be a little bit too off, so we're going to actually go ahead and fix this. It does look like this in the reference, but we also don't want to trust the reference too much. We want to make sure that we're making the decisions right there. So yeah, this should be fine. Now what we want to do is we want to make sure that this is in 3 mode. Let's go ahead and press this in 3. As you can see, we need a lot more of supporting edges out in the edges right there. So yeah, definitely a lot more supporting edges. So we can go over here to, we can go ahead back over here, put it to 1 mode. And something we can do actually to be able to make edge loops here really, really quickly is that we can actually add bevels here. So what we can do is we can go over here and then select these edges. Now this approach right here, I would do it with a lot of caution because sometimes bevels can cause a couple of problems when it comes to topology. But for our purposes here, it seems like a very simple mesh, so we can just go ahead and work with this. So let's go ahead and just select, Shift select right here, double click, Shift, double click. So we have these, and then we also want to have supporting edges here, so you can actually just Shift double click here. Oh, make sure. Take this. So we have everything selected, and just make sure this is the same. I think we need to select this area as well. So go back here. Awesome. So now that we have these selected, we also want to select this. And then we just want to select these corners right here where you want to hold them. Not necessarily these, because these can just be there, and you want to actually have these be a little bit more smoother. So whatever you don't want to have smooth, you want to select those. Go over here, and then let's go ahead and go to Edit Mesh, and then click Bevel. Now whenever we do this, we can obviously increase like the fraction to kind of keep it somewhere around here. And then once we do this, now if we're to go ahead and press 3, it looks a lot more closer to what we want because these bevels are being supporting the edges right here and creasing them properly. So this seems to look pretty darn close to what we want this to be. So I'd say this is pretty much a win. So now we can do the fun part, which is duplicating this and just putting it on other parts of the mesh. A small little thing we're going to do right here is we're going to do one last little adjustment. We're going to go ahead and select this area right here. Oh no, it seems to be selecting everything. Okay, so we can just go ahead and Shift select here and select this area. Okay, perfect. And then go back here, and I'm just gonna twist this just a little bit right there. Okay, so this seems to look a little bit more accurate. Awesome. So now we go over to object mode, and then we can just, it doesn't even have to, let's actually check the thickness real quick. And the thickness seems to be pretty darn good. We don't have to do any of the notching or stuff here because you're not gonna see it. So we can just go ahead and just duplicate this to this other area right here. So Shift D, duplicate, move this up, move this over here. And then you want to put it right over here if I'm not mistaken. So let's hide this. And yep, we actually got it in the right spot. So just right over here. I actually want to rotate this just a little bit. And then, yeah, this seems to be pretty darn accurate. Cool. So now we actually see that we have a couple of things hidden. So let's go ahead and unhide these. You can see if they're hidden because their names are grayed out. So P cube, these are actually grayed out, so we can actually ungrade them out. something really important. Organization is super important with modeling, and the biggest mistake you can do is just actually keep them all named as p cylinder, p cube, all of these stuff. Now I'm doing it just because we wanted to show how things are, but I would highly recommend labeling them as dial 1, dial 2, or spring 1 and spring 2, and getting these all named properly. I'd find that to be very important. And then something else I would do is, let's say we have these two dials right here, right? What I would do is I actually make them into a group, and I would change the name this to dials. This can be really useful for a lot of different things. One thing that this can be useful for is for rigging, and the other thing that it can also be useful for is applying materials to multiple things that are related with each other. So now that we have this should be looking pretty darn good. And now if we were to go into our perspective mode, we can admire our glorious little thing. Oops, we just realized something. Now that we orbit it around and see how everything was, we can actually catch this little mistake of the fact that it's not actually on the model. So now we can put that in there, and yeah, this is looking pretty darn good. Now we can get to this little notch stand right here, this little stand area, and that's pretty much just a duplication of this. So if we just go over here, go to side view mode, Shift D, move this up, and then put this right there, and then scale this down. Oh, as you can see, something really important to see is that it's actually scaling down these individually. So what I would do is actually make this into a group. I'm going to call this the stand notch, I guess. And you can name these whatever you want it to be. And I'm going to select the group, and then we're going to scale the group itself. Now, something to note is that the group's pivot is over here. Now, let's say we just want to move this to the center of the objects that are influencing it. You can just go to Modify, and then go to Center Pivot, and then it'll immediately get to the center of all of this mass. And so this right here is exactly what we want. So we can just push that right there. And I think what I'm going to do is we're going to actually not use this bracket. It's a little bit too much detail that I don't think we really need to do for this assignment. So we can just go over here, then make sure it's in the correct spot, which it actually seems like it isn't mostly in the correct spot. So we just have to keep that right there. And yeah, we got ourselves a little stand. And perfect, yeah, we're pretty much done with the stand portion of this. So the next portion we have to worry about is the actual bulb and the light itself. The way that we actually do about this is going to be a little bit different compared to the polygonal modeling that we did here. So we're actually going to be modeling using curves, which is called NURBS modeling. So the way that we're going to do this, and the reason why I'm going to do this method is because it's going to make this entire process a whole lot faster. So let's go ahead and get started by taking this EP curve tool in the curved surfaces area. We take this, and then we just start tracing along here like you would any sort of NURBS curve or Bezier curve that you'd find in a program like Photoshop. So we're just going to move this right there, click. As you can see, we might want to actually drag this out just a little bit. Click, and then click right there. Now you want to be careful with how you're clicking, because you want to make sure that it's actually getting nice and sharp corners. And then we can obviously change points depending on how you want it to be. So right here, you're seeing that it's actually kind of having some trouble distorting out for some reason. So we might have to figure out how we can do this. And so we're getting these weird kind of tangents that we can kind of move across and get this to be in a better position. So if we were to take this, move it this way, this way, this way, and then this way. And then we basically have our curve right here. We can actually change these points and control them with the control vertex. And so we can actually take this and then move it around to the way that we want this to be. So same thing here, control vertex, select the vertex right here, and you can get it to a kind of approximate of where you want this to be. So it's not going to be 100% accurate, but we can try to get this as accurate as we want to. And I'd say that we can actually just put this here, because we just don't want it to be completely inaccurate, but I think this should be okay for now. Move this right there. Move this right there. Then move this last point to the spot right there. Awesome. So we have ourselves this kind of outline using these curves and the shape. So why exactly did we make this NURBS curve right here? Well, the way that we're going to be doing this is that we're actually going to be revolving around this kind of axis right here, which will be the z-axis, around this kind of center point to be able to create this object. So how exactly are we going to be able to make sure that this is our correct plane of axis? Well, the way to do that would actually just be to change the pivot point. So we're going to go ahead to modify and then center pivot. As you can see, the pivot point seems to be going up here instead of over here. So we can press D, move this pivot point down to a central area. So we want to put this right around there. That should be the correct spot. Press D again to go back to regular translation mode. Go to surfaces, go to revolve, press this button, make sure your axis preset is on Z, make sure the pivot is to the object, and you want to make sure that your output geometry is to polygons. You also want to make sure your segment is at 12. Now, if we go down here, we want to make sure we put our type to quads, we put our tessellation method to count, and then we put the count to around 500. I think this should be good, and we can start revolving. As you can see, something very interesting happens. We basically get our shape of the actual lamp that we want. And we got this pretty much very quickly with all the required subdivisions that we would be wanting from this object. That's what makes this methodology super cool, is that you're basically using NURBS and converting that into polygons to be able to create a very quick mesh without having to do a bunch of extrusions. So we do see that we have some problems right here, but that should be an easy fix. So let's go ahead and go into perspective mode. Let's go ahead and see what the issue is, and I think I know exactly why. This curve right here seems to have been going down, which is what's causing this weird issue. So all we have to do now is we have to take this curve, we can delete it now that it's just a mesh, and then we're going to go over here and we're going to select edges, and we're actually going to be deleting all these edges. Now, whenever you're deleting in Maya, something really important to note is that you don't just press delete. You want to press Control Delete, because that actually deletes all the vertices and all the edges. Because if you were to just do delete, it would just delete the edges, but not the vertices themselves. So this is a much cleaner way to work with. So now that we have this edge right here, we're going to select this edge loop. It doesn't seem like it's selecting the edge loop, which tells me that there might be a face here, which turns out to be true. So actually, so let's go ahead and take this edge right here, select it all, and then we're going to go over here. Now we're going to be doing the classic modeling that we've been learning always, which is to take this, and actually let's go ahead and add some subdivisions for the switch right here. We're going to go ahead and take this edge and then scale it up. And then we want to keep this kind of like level a little bit. We're going to take this one as well and then scale them both down and to get them to the exact size of the switch base right here. So keep that there and keep that right there. Awesome. Now we take this, select this edge loop, and then move it all the way over here. And then what we want to do is we actually want to scale this up this way. So perfect. We actually went ahead and scaled this up, move this down, and then we actually want to keep this level so that we can actually extrude from here. So we keep this here, bring this back, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do Shift and Extrude. Awesome. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to Shift and Extrude, but just a little bit so that we can actually scale this down. So let's go ahead and scale this down real quick and set it to the correct length right here. And then I want to translate this way a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and Shift, Extrude once more. And then now, if we were to go over here, we can go ahead and start closing these loops. Now, the way to close this, of course, you can actually go ahead and fill this up in many different ways. What I would recommend for people is to make this into quads, but for now, what we can do is we can go into Mesh and then Fill Hole. And then this bit pretty much closes this entire border right here. So perfect, yeah, we pretty much got our lamp right here and seems to be looking pretty darn good. Now, something to note that here is that we have the outside normals being reversed. So we might want to flip that up just a little bit. So the way to do that, of course, is that we go into object mode, go to mesh display, and then we want to set this to reverse. And now we have ourselves a nice, perfect mesh ready for us to go. Now, something you might be noticing here is that the inside now has this black area, which we do want to be able to texture this area. So how do we fix this? Well, the easiest way to fix this would actually be to select all of this mesh. So we can go ahead and just shift select everything. And what we can do is we can actually extrude this inward. And so what we can do right here is we can go into, we can actually type Control E, and then this actually poly extrudes this face. And then what we can do is we can do a local Z translate, which kind of scales it up a little bit so that you can actually have some sort of thickness inside this mesh. So extrusion is actually a really great way for creating thickness. So now we have ourselves a two-sided object where you can actually shade inside and on the outside, and we did that with extrusion. Perfect. So we now have our little mesh right here. We can actually put this in 3 mode and see how this looks, and it seems to look pretty darn good. Now, we do have some issues with the switch right here, so we might have to add a little bit of edge loops to kind of make this a little bit sharper. So we can kind of do that really quickly. The way to do that is go back to the Poly Modeling tab, take your knife cut tool, and go ahead and press Control and then add edge loops here to sharpen up this area. And then we're going to go ahead and do the same over here. Just a lot of edge loops to kind of support this all. Remember, you gotta add edge loops on both sides if you want to support edges. So that is something you gotta make sure to remember. Awesome. And then we want to make sure we add some here, and we want to add some holding edges all the way up here so that everything is nice and consistent. Sweet. And so now, if we were to go ahead and put this into 3 mode, this is looking a lot more closer to our 1 mode mesh, but also has the curvature where it needs to be, kind of like in the edges right there. Awesome. This is exactly what we want. We can actually go ahead and add one more little edge loop right here to make this a little bit more supported, but I think this actually looks really, really good. And because that we used this revolve technique, we actually were able to get this entire mesh very, very quickly. So yeah, we pretty much got our lamp right here. Most of it is pretty much done, with the exception of a couple different things. First things first, we want to actually add a little bit of a light bulb here. So we're actually going to be using this exact same method. So yeah, let's go ahead and go over here, and we're going to start creating our Bezier curve. So go over to here, and then what we want to do is we want to start from the center, which is right over here. So we want to go right there, create a nice little curvature. Then move it up to here. And then put it to a point that should be right there. Remember, the internals don't have to be super accurate because all we're trying to do is to get the basic form of it for the things that we are going to see. So this should be okay right there. Next, what we want to do is that we have our curve right here. So we're going to revolve around this axis that we have. So we're going to go over to surfaces, go to revolve, and then we're going to keep it to the object itself. Oh, something really important. We want to make sure that the object's pivot point is in the correct spot that we want it to revolve. So remember, we got to use D, bring this up to the place that we want it to be. So for me, I want this to revolve right around the tip of this actual light bulb. Let's go ahead and put it right there. And then this should be good. So now if we press D again, and now if we were to go to surfaces, revolve, and then make sure our settings are correct, which is Z, making sure the pivot is object, putting our segments to 12. We can actually change this to 8 just to keep it a little bit simpler. We can set our output geometry to polygons, making sure it's quads. And the tessellation method is count, and then we set the count to whatever we want it to be. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and say we should do 250, and then we can go ahead and revolve. And we have ourselves a nice little light bulb just created out of nowhere. And this is great. We can actually see our little light bulb right here, and we can actually go ahead, go to mesh display and then reverse. So we have ourselves a nice, perfectly normaled light bulb right here. Make it a little bit bigger so it's like fitting into it. Scaling it down so that it's not going all the way in. This actually feels like a very comically large bulb right here. So we can go ahead and just like put it in so that it's not being too big. So we can put it right there. And something we can do is we can actually delete this curve right here. Oh, that's not a good idea. So it seems like the curve is still tied. So if we were to delete this, it seems to be that the curve is actually there. So what we can do is we can take this, go to edit, delete by type history, and then we can now delete the curve without having this actually having any problems. Something else that we notice is that we have a little bit of a hole here. So we can go to this edge and then select this loop. And actually, we're going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. Now, if you can see, we want to make this bigger by using the edge slide. So we're going to do Control and Shift. Then we're going to slide the edge up, and then we're going to fill it. We want to go into Mesh. Then we're going to go into Fill Hole. And we have our hole that is filled now with an N-gon. And it should be fine that it's an N-gon. We put it to 3 mode to make it nice and smooth. And then what we can do here is that we can actually put this more in. So right now our pivot's right there, so we're going to go Modify, Center Pivot, move this in, and then we're going to go ahead and scale it here. And we just want to kind of size and shape things as we go. We're not going to be seeing a lot of this, so we can just kind of keep it right there. And yeah, this looks pretty darn good. We can just kind of push this out a little bit more, this more here, make it just a little bit bigger. And yeah, we have ourselves a nice little lamp that is perfectly fit in. Kind of move this out a little bit, make this a little bigger. And yeah, we have ourselves a nice little lamp. And our lamp is pretty much done. We're going to do one more little object right here, and that is going to be the wires, which is probably the one thing that you've kind of noticed is kind of missing from here. The way to do the wires is actually something relatively simple. It's a similar method to how we do this, but instead of having a revolution, we're going to be doing something called a sweep mesh. So let's go ahead and do that. The way that we do this is we go over here to the side view, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually create another Bezier curve, but this time I'll actually do the Bezier curve in a different way. I'm going to go ahead and use the pencil curve tool to actually draw how I want the wires to be. So I can draw this right here. We can have this traveling up. So we can have this traveling this way. And then we can loop it around and then put it back in. Awesome. Now, this is drawn in a 2D sense, so it's not going to be entirely accurate, but you can go ahead and control some of these points. So for example, I want to take this one, and I want to actually push this in a little bit. And not everything has to be exactly perfect, but we just want to create and make sure that we're getting this as close as possible to where it seems plausible. And keep that right there. And then this part seems to be okay. Actually, Control Vertex, select this point, put that right there. There we go. And then we have this part right here. We can actually move this point around so that it seems a little bit more plausible. So curve point, we want to actually move this down this way. That should be good. We definitely want to move the point over here out this way. And then there seems to be a control point inside where we might just have to zoom in and see where this control point is. That's a real sneaky little control point right there. So what we have to do is we want to move this over here. Probably move this more to the side. Move this little point to the side. There still seems to be one sneaky little point right there. So we might have to just see. And let's see. Let's find where this hidden point is, right there. Perfect. We actually want to put this right there. And then this seems to look a little bit better. You can move this in a little bit for a little bit more plausibility on how this wire would actually be resting. So we can actually push this in a little. Same thing here, that it's kind of sitting right on top of it, right there. And of course, push this point up because nothing just curves like that. So you can kind of play around with this and make this as accurate as you want it to be. We just want to keep this like somewhere looking pretty reasonable as far as how we want things to flow. The other thing too is because we drew this in a specific axis, it's not going to be fully 3D, which is why we might have to move a lot of these points out and get them to a point where they're just wrapping around at the edge. So we can push all of this back here, right there. And then what we can do is we can just kind of rotate it around and then put them right there. Take this control point, move it right there. Move these kind of down a little bit, and then move this stuff all the way down there. Now we can keep that like hanging around. Put this one, put that right around there. And I think this looks pretty darn good. So yeah, I'd say this seems like a pretty reasonable wire that we have right here. So we have this kind of wrapping around exactly like the way that we want it. But now we want to add some sort of dimensionality to this curve. So the way that we're going to be doing this is we go to the Poly Modeling tab, and you see this little option called Sweep Mesh. Now, for some reason, this tool can sometimes not work. And if for some reason it doesn't work, and if you're getting an error message here, what you can do is you can go to Windows, go to Settings and Preferences, and then go into the Plugin Manager, and make sure that you type in sweep.mmll, and make sure that this is loaded. Once this is loaded, this tool will absolutely work. So I have this loaded already and everything seems to be good. So we can go ahead and sweep mesh this. As you can see, we're getting some very, very, very thick wires. So we definitely have to go ahead and change a little bit of the things. So we have an 8-sided wire, which that should be fine. We can go to our transformation, and right now the scale profile is way too big. So we definitely want to make sure that we get this a little bit less of a radius. So you can put this somewhere over there. And we can scale it up to kind of how our wire is right there. So somewhere like this. And we want to do the interpolation. We actually want to kind of increase this interpolation so it's feeling a little bit better curved. And this looks a lot more closer to the wire that we have right now. This seems to be pretty good. And actually we can put this all the way up to 100 and then just optimize it. And yeah, we have ourselves a nice little wire already created for us because of the sweep mesh. And it seems to look pretty darn accurate. So now, officially, we have ourselves our nice little lamp. And it's now officially created. It looks pretty similar to our reference right there. And we have ourselves our very first model, completed all in Autodesk Maya. So now you might be thinking, wow, my model is done. My work here is done, right? Wrong, it's not done. And the reason why is because your hierarchy is such a mess. So what we want to do actually is we want to do a couple of things. We're going to go ahead and select all of these objects. Actually, we're going to go into the dials. We're going to select these two objects. And I'm going to selecting these with Shift right here. And then what we want to do, it seems like we aren't really selecting a revolve surface, so we're going to go ahead and do that as well. Take our sweep mesh. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to do something very, very important to make sure that all of these are set to 0 and they're all set to its default state. Because we ended up like translating, rotating, scaling a bunch of stuff, and we also ended up extruding a bunch of things. So we want to make sure that everything is now reset to say that, hey, this right here is the default position for everything. And so the way that we do that is actually pretty simple. We go into Modify, we're going to go into Freeze Transformations. So right here, you want to make sure that all of this, except for Joint Orient, is selected, and then Freeze Transformations on all of them. And then we're going to File, actually we're going to go to Edit, and then we're going to go to Delete by Type, and then we're going to press Delete by Type History. We're going to select that, and then everything should be set to 0, 0, 0 all over the translate and the rotate, and the scale should be 1, 1, 1 across the board. So now that we have all of these set to their transforms, what we want to do is we want to take all of this, and essentially the main thing to do actually is to make sure that you actually label all of these. So let's go ahead and start doing that. So this right here is the base cylinder. So we labeled that there. We're going to label this one as the bottom stand, bottom of stand. I can go ahead and do that. And then this one right here is like bottom of stand upper piece. You can really name them whatever you want to. It's just for organization's sake. We're going to call this one the bottom bracket. We're going to call this one the middle bracket. We're going to call this one the top bracket. Then we're going to call these right here. We're actually going to go ahead and take these little cubes right here, and then we're actually going to group them, and we're going to call this group, actually we're going to move this group up over here. So to move groups, what you have to do is select the group, middle mouse, drag up to a certain spot. So I can put this right here, and I'm going to call this one the supports. And then we have this helix right here, so these are all the springs. We're going to actually do another group here. I'm going to move this up near here. We're going to call this one springs. Wonderful. And then we have these spheres, which are probably all going to be the bolts that we made, with the exception of these, but these seem to be separate. So we're going to go ahead and group these up. We're going to call these bolts. Actually, I don't know. Yeah, they are bolts, I think. Yeah. Then we're going to actually move this up. Actually, they're not bolts. They're screws. Just remembered. So we're going to put these here. We have our brackets here. Then we have our revolved surface, which is technically, this one is the lamp shade. This right here is the bulb. And we have these right here, which these seem to be inside of the dials. So we already had these in a group, which is pretty good. And then our sweep is technically our wire. And then this curve, I think we can actually go ahead and delete, and it shouldn't cause any problems here. And yeah, didn't seem to, so that sounds good. So now that we have all of these all kind of labeled and in their specific spots, we're actually going to go ahead and move the pieces that are here and move them up here. And then we can further categorize these as the main lamp pieces. So we can just kind of keep these all over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make all of this into a group. So we're going to do Control G, and I'm going to call this one the lamp. Now we can actually go ahead and finally delete our references. And now, finally, we have ourselves a nice little lamp that can be used for whatever you want to and use later on to surface. So this right here is the end of our modeling tutorial. I hope you all learned a lot from this, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.